morning, Dr. Connett. Welcome to Puerto Rico. I know it's not your first time, and we're really grateful that you're here again with us trying to defend this beautiful island that's in the middle of the Caribbean. Before we start talking about the subject, I just wanted to have people know your background, because I think it's really important that if you say something like this and you have, the knowledge, that we should really pay attention to what you have to say about this. I know you're a doctor in chemistry, not a doctor in like a medical doctor, but can you explain a little bit to us what you've been doing concerning the incinerator and the landfills and waste disposal?
Yes, I got my first degree from Cambridge University in England and my PhD in chemistry from Dartmouth. And shortly after getting that PhD, I started teaching at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. And only a year and a half into that, namely 1985, I got embroiled in a local battle fighting a local incinerator. And because I got involved with that, and because I had a PhD in chemistry, I was in big demand, not just locally to fight the incinerator, but from first around the state, and then around the region, and then around the country, then eventually around the world. To cut a long story short, over the last 30 years, I've been to 49 states in the United States, still haven't been to Alaska, 7 provinces in Canada, and 62 other countries. Most of that on waste, all pro bono. I don't charge communities for my help. I'm only too happy to share my chemical knowledge. First of all, on the dangers of incineration, and more recently on the alternatives, which have amalgamated into the zero waste strategy. So that's what I've been doing.
Okay, we know that when you study in school, how humanity has evolved from a simple type of life to industrial, and how important this industrial thing is for countries that think that they are not prosperous if they don't have this big industrial setup.
Yeah.
And how that industrial setup has messed up nature and community life and human and nature's health, because it affects everybody, right? But and that is why now you see that they're talking about sustainable development, sustainable agriculture, and United Nations has a big thing going on with trying to correct all the mess that we've made. And because we have big interests and rich countries taking advantage of poor countries with resources, but not good mechanisms to control their natural resources and their people, and how now we see that we're doing damage not only to the progress countries, but to the other countries that are supposed to be third world. And it's been a big thing lately. A lot of people don't know about it yet, but they're starting to talk about it at a United Nations level. So I would like you to explain a little bit what sustainable development is as far as using our natural resources is, and why incineration is not that, and then we can go into the alternatives that fall into
I think one of the things that we're going to have to do for the future is to distinguish between social progress and technological progress. We think because the machine does it better than the last machine, that's progress. But at the same time, we are consuming this planet with all kinds of consequences, which you alluded to. We're ripping down rainforests, we're losing species, we're contaminating the oceans, 7 times more plastic pieces than plankton in certain parts of the Pacific. And we're running out of resources. So people have calculated that we would need 5 planets to sustain the world if everybody consumed like an American, and we would need 2 if everybody consumed like a European. And meanwhile, we have India and China copying our consumption patterns. Clearly, we cannot continue in this way. We're sleepwalking. We cannot continue in the way that we are going. And incineration is an attempt to continue business as usual. In other words, you can continue to buy things, throw them away, buy things, throw them away, and it doesn't matter, because someone's going to gather them all up and burn them in the big machine, and no one's is going to notice. But of course we do notice. First of all, in the burning process, you produce some very, very toxic byproducts. You release toxic metals from otherwise stable matrices like plastics and paper and so on. And you also generate substances called dioxins and furans, the most toxic substances we've ever made in a chemical laboratory. And at the same time, making that even worse is that most of these toxics are coming out on the surface of very, very tiny particles called nanoparticles. And the thing that's scary about nanoparticles is they're so tiny, they're very difficult to capture in air pollution control devices. And secondly, they go deep into our lungs and are able to cross the lung membranes and the membranes of the gastrointestinal tract because they're so tiny. There's no defense against these tiny particles which contain these toxic substances. This is a relatively new subject called nanotoxicology, and it's very scary. And the thing which is frustrating for me is that even if you made an incineration safe, supposing you were able to put the filters on and capture everything, they haven't been able to do it yet, but suppose they could, and supposing they found a place to put the ash, for every 3 tons of trash that you burn, you get about a ton of ash, and nobody wants that. So you don't get rid of landfills. But suppose you could all the toxics and you found a safe place to put the ash. Would you make it sensible then to do this? Absolutely not. Not now we've reached the 21st century, which what we should be thinking about is sustainability. And the absolute opposite of sustainability is to use things for a few seconds and then burn them. Where do people think the resources are going to come for that process? Just to use things for a few minutes and then just burn them for a few penny worth of energy.
And then go back again when you need it again, because you have to go back to the earth and pull it out again.
Yeah, and there's also a double irony here. Not only are you wasting resources, but every time you burn something, you've got to go all the way back to the beginning and start the process all again. You've got to extract the raw materials. You've got to transport the raw materials around the world. You've got to manufacture new products and more transport, more transport. Well, all that energy involved in extraction, in manufacture and transport, you cannot recover that through burning. You only get the calorific value of the paper and the plastics in the stuff that you're burning. You can't tap into the energy that you've put into extraction, transport and manufacture. Well, so what? Well, so what? You can tap into that energy. You can save that energy the next time round for your products and packaging. If A, you recycle, that cuts out the impacts, all the energy you've used in extraction. If you reuse the whole object, you cut out the energy and all the pollution in both extraction and manufacture. Same with composting. And of course, if you avoid the packaging or the product in the first place because you don't need them, then you again mitigate all those impacts. So the simple way of saying that is incineration is simply not sustainable. And if we're going to put any money, any effort into handling waste in a more responsible manner, then we should do it with recycling, reuse, composting, and waste reduction efforts. And then, of course, the other side, if they were here, they say, oh yeah, we agree with Dr. Connett, but there's always going to be that stuff left over. And that's why we have to build the incinerator right now. Well, of course, that's nonsense. You don't build it right now until you've demonstrated that Puerto Rico has maximized, is up to 70 or 80% diversion, which is what they're doing now in San Francisco. And over 1,000 communities in Italy are getting over 70% diversion, and over 300 getting 80% diversion. So until Puerto Rico's got to 70 or 80%, you shouldn't even be thinking about incineration. But at that point, I would come back into the picture and say, instead of burning the residual fraction at the end, you separate the residuals at a facility in front of the landfill, and then you research them, you look at them, that you examine them, you get your professors and students to examine them and say to industry, look, if we can't reuse it, recycle it or compost it, you shouldn't be making it. We need redesign. So in terms of understanding this zero waste strategy, there's 4 R's, 3 of which are familiar with most people. The 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle. Well, that's community responsibility. The community has to organize to do that. But the 4th R is redesign. That's industrial responsibility. So although zero waste sounds pretty idealistic and impossible when you first hear it. When you see it as a combination of community responsibility and industrial responsibility, it looks much more feasible, and then it becomes clear that this is the stepping stone towards sustainability. If we're interested in sustainability, then we must go the zero waste direction. It's a moral imperative. If sustainability is a moral imperative on a finite planet, then so is developing a zero waste society. And we shouldn't rest until we've achieved the absolute maximum we can. And there's nowhere near the maximum that's been achieved yet in Puerto Rico.
You know, with this emergency, this economical emergency that we had, or crisis that we had for the last few years, on a personal level, a lot of people have been managing their personal resources because they lost their job, they were going to lose their property, and they've had to restructure their thinking, use the things they have in better ways, repair the things that were there that they could use, and redesign their life, their careers, and everything else. And I don't see why the governments don't see that that's what we have to do on a collective level, and the government should be doing that. You know, we have duplicity of things, and as you say, I've seen that in other countries there's legislation to restrict the way things are packed.
Yeah.
With a responsibility to the manufacturer that he has to recover or pay for the disposal of the packing materials. And that has made people reduce the packing. I just bought a new Samsung device, and the box came in all brown, no ink or anything that contaminates. So it might be a gimmick, and some companies are doing it to appeal, but I really think there is a good intention in most people.
And it's good that I'm glad you mentioned this, because in some respects, industry, especially the industry making durable goods, is way ahead of communities. They've already got, many industries already have zero waste programs, because they recognize that waste is the visible face of inefficiency. Solid waste is the visible face of inefficiency. If you make less waste, you're more efficient, you're more competitive, you save money. But when communities opt to build incinerators, they're telling the world, we've got money to burn. This literally, they're saying, we've got money to burn, because the only thing you successfully burn in an incinerator is taxpayers' money. And let me tell you a funny story about this, actually, which illustrates this point. I wrote an essay some time ago called something like Municipal Waste Incineration, the Wrong Solution for the 21st Century. It's a paper I delivered in Amsterdam in 1998 to the incinerator industry. It was fascinating. I was on my, absolutely, I made sure that I had every fact right, because I was right in the lion's den. The den. Well, this was published, and shortly afterwards, I heard that in Japan, they had a special meeting of the combustion engineers in Japan, the guys that build incinerators in Japan. They've hundreds of incinerators in Japan, devoted to this paper, to demolishing this paper. And local people were rather upset that they did this without me being there. They thought, well, if you're going to demolish Dr. Connett's paper, he should be present to respond. So they invited me back, and about the next year I went back, and for 4 hours we went backwards and forwards. They had 2 hours, I had 2 hours, but we went backwards and forwards with all these Japanese engineers. And there were two things which astounded me. And the first thing was, I was explaining how incredibly expensive incinerators were, and their response was, expenses is no problem for us. We're prepared to pay anything to do this, to burn stuff. I thought, that's peculiar, but that's what they said. Expense was no problem. And the second thing I said, well, what about the social ramifications? You create very few jobs in an incinerator. I mean, you can spend almost $500 million on an incinerator and get less than 100 jobs. And they said, the social ramifications don't interest us. So these are engineers, really engineers. The only thing that interested them were all the gadgets and gadgets, the things in the thing, to make sure that they were meeting all their requirements and so on. All the rest, how much it was costing, jobs and so on. Now, I don't think people can extrapolate from that Japanese experience and apply it to the island of Puerto Rico. As you've rightly said, most people on this island are having to pull their belts in. They're very careful about what they're spending, and the government should be the same. And if you're going to invest